Good morning, everyone. If I can get this thing to work, I am going to say something about the ethics of research, the ethics of science, whether it's open or not. And I think that the time that we're in now is, for research, is always a time of transition and always a time of change, but I think it's more so now than for most other phases that we've been through in the last few decades. Let's see. There you go. So, first the good side, the notion of sharing data, of open data. It's a wonderful thing, and it's been made possible in a way that it wasn't earlier due to technology. And also we have more data due to technology and the use of it. And data sharing is really the only way to go. These are three alternative R's. It's rational, it makes sense to share data. It would not make sense not to share them. It's reasonable, it's fair. There's been a lot of talk about haves and have-nots in science, and the more you can share data, the better in that way. And it's resource efficient. It's not that uncommon that the same sort of job is done several times at increased cost by different institutions and different researchers, and that's just irrational. So I think for all of these reasons, the idea of data sharing it's not just that it's a good idea, it's rather that not doing it would be doing something wrong. It's actually more or less an obligation to share data. And going back to the sort of the ethics of this, what's the basis for sharing? I think looking at the internal standards of science will help us to sort of spell out more what we're already feeling, that this is a good thing and a good idea. And to my mind, the best articulation of the sort of ethos of science was made during the 1940s by Merton, his KUDOS acronym. It's sort of extra cool for a nerd because KUDOS also means sort of repute in ancient Greek. But what it stands for as an acronym is communalism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism as a sort of expression of the basic value internal to science to the extent that it works properly. Now, communalism, which he originally called communism, but he had to alter the word in face of McCarthy hearings and so on. Communalism is just the idea that whatever is done in research is shared. So it would go for data, for hypotheses, for arguments, for criticism, and so on. Universalism also adds the notion that it doesn't really matter who said it. What's important is whether it's well put. So the idea is that, ideally, it's actually the argument or the quality of the research that counts and not where it came from. This was, of course, in some ways a much bigger issue at the time during the 40s than it is today, but it's still a good thing to be reminded of. Then disinterestedness does not mean, in this context, that you don't really care about your job. In a way, it's almost the opposite. It's a Kantian notion of disinterestedness, which means that you're not just in it for fame, glory, and the money. You're actually in it because you're looking for truth, you're looking for knowledge, you're part of that kind of an enterprise. Organized skepticism, finally, is sort of the way that science works when it works well. It's the very notion that if you're just doing it on your own, you might be having a good time, but it's probably not science. It's only by the fact that scientific activity is a shared activity. It's an activity where people criticize each other, build on each other, and agree and disagree in an organized, rational manner. It's only to the extent that this is going on that we're having science at all and not something else. Of course, in real life, none of these are ever perfectly realized. I'm sure most of you have thought of ways in which other forces will work in another direction and so on. But these are still sort of ideals that I think are sufficiently central so that if you take them completely away, you take away science. There cannot be science or research without these values playing some part. The importance of this when it comes to sharing data has to do also with the simple fact of validating existing research. It's often very difficult to see the quality of research if you don't know the data behind it. I mean, just for that fact, you need some access to other people's data. Otherwise, and also methodologies like algorithms, otherwise you don't really know whether their research is valid at all. So that's a very central issue. Now, this is a bit of source code, really. I mean, you've all seen probably loads of different research ethics guidelines in your careers so far. Some of them can be sort of fit into one sheet of paper, others fill up entire books, but what they all have in common, the source code, the basis for it all, is this. So different committees find different ways of sort of hiding the reason, but this is really what it's all about. Three basic principles in relation to the people that you're doing research on or with in social research or in medical research or biological research. There's the idea of good consequences. Does this research make an impact to make the world better or worse, or is it just indifferent? The idea of good consequences and avoiding bad ones is one completely central and irreducible ethical dimension of research. The second one is respect for persons. Now that's not reducible to good consequences if you think of that as a purely sort of general way. So it needs to be lifted up as a separate principle. The idea that when you relate to persons, you have to relate to them as persons, that is to say, as beings who should have a say in matters that pertain to their own lives, beings who should be able to make up their own minds about things that affect them. And thirdly, justice, which is also figured in all research ethics guidelines, at least since the Belmont report of the 1970s. It can be, this is the most vague of them all, it can be used in very many different ways. The basic way in which it was thought originally was that the people who participate in research and the people who benefit from it should be in some kind of relation. So if you're doing let's say clinical trials and you're doing all the dangerous testing on development on a population from a developing country, and the results will only be available to people in rich countries, you have a problem with justice, basically. So these are the three things that you can now go back and look at different research ethics guidelines, and this is what you'll find spelled out in so many words. Okay, now, when it comes to social science and medical science and some other branches as well, there is a particular challenge, namely that the data that we should at the outset be sharing is data about people. It's personal data. And that, in a way, is a game changer. It really changes everything as far as how we need to think about that data. Most of you know the sort of the traditional grouping of data. You have personal data, then you have the notion of de-identified data, which means that as seen by the researchers getting access, he or she will not be able to tell whose data this is, which person's, but there is a key. So you can re-identify what has been de-identified. Then there's a special grouping of data within the personal data that's called sensitive data. Not all regulations include this, but I think most national laws will have a special group of kinds of data that are considered sensitive, like things having to do with health, religion, sexuality, politics, those kinds of issues. Then there's anonymized data, which traditionally has been the way to skip all the legal and a lot of the ethical issues. If you manage to anonymize data, you're sort of safe. And it's because if it's really anonymized, it's no longer personal data. So any kind of privacy law, any kind of personal data jurisdiction just sort of drops off the table immediately. Now, the situation today is very different than it was previously, and I think big data, what we these days call big data, is sort of the easiest way of seeing this challenge. In the old system, I'm oversimplifying now, clearly, but that's the only way to get this through in 20 or 30 minutes. In the old system, what you needed to do to see if a data set was anonymized was simply to look at the data set. That was sort of the standard. You could see if enough stuff had been deleted, you were left with an anonymized set. And you could sort of, with a trained eye, you could more or less judge this. Today, with the reality of so much data being collected on each and every one of us, thousands of data points every day, even if you're having a quiet day, and it's all of it being stored as a default rather than deleted, and the existence of so many centers or holders of data. This is very different, because what you now have to do in order to see if something is anonymized is to look at the rest of the data in the world, not just the set that you're holding on to, because any putatively anonymized data set may be sort of paradoxically re-identified by comparing it or coupling it with other data sets, so that what looks like that there's no way back to the person, or in some cases perhaps a small group, a small minority group that might also get in trouble. But if you combine it with other sets of data, all of a sudden, what you thought was anonymized is no longer anonymized. And I think that big data is just sort of a premonition of this, what we're now calling big data. This is a new situation, and even very professional agents in the field have made mistakes here. They've thought that their data sets were anonymized, and they've just made a mess of it. And it turned out that some teenager with his computer managed to re-identify data in a matter of just the afternoon. So data sharing then, in face of this, means that we have to consider the fact that the research project lifecycle and the life cycle of the data are no longer traveling together in the way that they generally used to be. The classic idea of data is that you amass your own data. When you have enough, you do your research, and then you either delete it or you let someone else hold on to it, or you just you hold on to it secretly or whatever. But today, that's no longer the case. The data invariably comes with a history, and it goes on having a history after your project. So there's no simple match between the project and the data anymore. And this means that we have a much more intricate and confused situation when we're going to evaluate what could happen to the data in different kinds of combinations. And I think even that some of the basic principles of all privacy law previously, like minimality, it's just, there's no way to, at least I see no way of really making sense of minimality in the face of big data. Minimality, as I said, you need generally you need a specified purpose for what data you're holding. You only hold on to the necessary bits and pieces, but this is not the way that things are done anymore. So a lot of the work can be done by ensuring good consequences. There are many ways in which to ensure good consequences, which in this context means primarily safety and security for the concerning the data, so that there is no risk of abuse, there is no risk of re-identification, there is no risk of anyone having, either as research participants or as just people, like we all are, having some of this come back and hit them in the face. This is just one way of doing it. I'm not trying to sell that solution, but it's just one developed way of thinking about safety when it comes to consequences. So it's the UK data service 5 safes. Safe people. If you want access to the data, you need some kind of training, vetting, approval. You don't get it just because you call yourself a researcher. You get access only after you've had some kind of training, so that you know what you're doing. Second, safe projects. There's an ethics evaluation of the project to see whether it's satisfactory in the required respects. Then there's the idea of safe data, that the data is such that there's a minimized risk of disclosure. There's safe environment. In their case, access only in securely assured locations, and safe outputs, because sometimes even the publications can reveal more than you thought. Now, here comes my sort of main message and main point and main difficulty, is that you can have all the good consequences in the world, that you can have all the safety in the world, but it does not add up to respect for persons. You can imagine a world where everything is taken care of, so everything is hunky-dory the whole way, but if people don't have a say in what's happening to their own data, if people don't have any kind of say in the whole process, you've lost respect for persons along the way. And it's irreducible. You cannot do this just by saying that it's safe. Don't worry, just walk on, there's nothing to see here. That's just not the right way to do it, because respect for persons, having persons being able to decide for themselves, is irreducible here. The way of ensuring that you sort of can tick the respect for persons bit off in your form has always been, and is today, consent. It's sort of the default way of doing it. It's not an unproblematic way. I think in very many cases, perhaps most cases, it's somehow abused, but it is a way that we have not found another way of securing respect for persons that works like this. The idea of consent, then, of course, is only viable if the consent is informed and if it is voluntary. So consent that's not informed is not consent. It's just saying whatever, or saying, yeah, I don't know. If you're not informed about what's this for, is there any risk for me? Who's paying for this, by the way? Is it going to go on for a long time? If you don't know any of this information, you cannot consent. You may perhaps nod, or you may sign your name or whatever, but that's not consent. Consent requires that you have a basis for making up your mind. Similarly with it being voluntary, and here we have many different degrees, of course. You don't have to be sort of threatening someone with violence in order to undermine voluntariness. Any kind of pressure is problematic in this kind of setting. So the standard replies. Now I'm just going to go through them and suggest that that this is not necessarily so. Sorry if the writing is slightly small. Can you read it back there? Yeah. Oh, some nodding. Some can read it. So the first one is just the idea that it's unnecessary. But like I said, that's the wrong answer, because respect for persons is not reducible to good consequences. So it's not unnecessary in that way. Impractical is also a very common reply, but that's starting in the wrong end. That's putting the cart before the horse. If it's impractical, that doesn't do anything, because you have to start by evaluating the research. Is this research so important, so excellent, that it's okay to drop the rule for once? That's the way to ask the question, not whether it's impractical for any given research project. Because mind you, I'm not advocating sort of all research being consent-based. That's not feasible, and it's never been the case. But I'm just trying to point out that if we have a significant reduction in consent, then we have a significant reduction in respect for persons, and that's a problematic thing. Third, that is simply unworkable. That's usually just because the researchers or the institutions have not been doing this in the right way. You've all seen so-called consent forms that look like old-fashioned sort of phone books, you know, that just go on for miles and miles if you bother to scroll down at all, instead of just saying okay. Now that's not really consent. That's a way of getting what you want. And I think that's one of the most basic misunderstandings when it comes to consent. This sort of belief that consent is there to cover the researcher's arse, or to cover the institution's arse. It isn't. Consent is not primarily a way of securing the institution against court cases and expenses. It's just a way of promising something, a formalized way of promising that you'll take care of things in the right way, and of informing people about what's going to happen and allowing them to choose. And most consent forms, the way they look today, are clearly not made with that in mind. They're made they're made by lawyers for lawyers, basically, and not with the idea of informing people in a decent manner. The way that this works today, it's been estimated that if we all, just in our sort of everyday lives, were to read all the so-called consent forms that we have to agree to just to use apps, do whatever we do, it would take about 1 month out of each year for each of us to read those things. Of course, we don't do that, you know. I don't think I've read one of those things in years now. It's just not feasible the way that it's working today. Finally, impossible? No, it's not impossible. It used to be much more impossible a generation ago. With today's technology, it's actually easier than it's ever been to ensure, to obtain, as it's called, obtain consent. Finally, this does not mean that it's realistic to do so on the level of the single research project always. I mean, if you're getting access to data to run through, say, 2-3 million people, each with countless data points, it's not realistic and it's not right to necessarily to ensure that that project does a separate run of consent with 2 million people. I think that, again, what we need to do is to just use this time of transition, to take very seriously the idea of changing things on a higher level. I think there is an analogy here with the idea of open access. Open access was met with exactly these same kinds of replies for years and years and years. This sort of just buffed off as that's unrealistic, that's naive. And it is naive if you think that the single researcher sitting in her little cell is going to just put her publications out on her website instead of actually getting points for publishing internationally. Of course that's unrealistic, and only a few very idealistic people would do so. Even on the level of the institution, it's fairly unrealistic. But notice what happened with open access. Everyone says it's unrealistic. Then if the level of the EU says, let's go open access, everyone's going open access. It's sort of almost overnight. Not that it's perfect now, and not that it's completely implemented, but I think that thinking in terms of how we can ensure consent in a decent way requires an initiative on that kind of level. Also, that it's technologically feasible, I think, and again, I'm not advocating this particular brand of solution over others, but just as an example, Alex Pentland's New Data Initiative he's at MIT, is an example of a sort of illustration of it not being entirely unrealistic. Now, he has a view of personal data that's pretty close to sort of the way we now are used to thinking about money. So we have the same problem with money. We need some way of ensuring that all of your different funds and all of your different expenses and all of your different relations, different people must be coordinated somehow by some kind of entity that could do this properly. And some people might say that's just very naive. You can't. It's not possible. It's very, very difficult to do that kind of thing. Well, they're called banks. Yeah, and that's sort of the mindset of this particular initiative, is to say, well, we need something like a bank for personal data, some kind of way of taking care of it and giving people the level of information that they want, so that you could choose, for instance, down to a sort of very detailed level, knowing what's happening with your data, with the different data sets that you're part of. You could also choose the sort of I don't care, but I get to find out if I want to approach. This is just to mention one way of doing it. There is a sort of halfway house between letting everything go and holding on to respect for people in the full sense, and that's just trust. Not any kind of trust, not the kind of trust that children have for their parents, which should be sort of blind and without conditions, but a sort of reasoned trust. So in other words, not really trust, but we call it trust because it's nicer. Trust in the sense of you having a reason to let the researchers or the office or the department or whatever handle your personal data. And I think that's on the level of trust here. The idea of reasoned trust is a very important way to go, but it doesn't bring us all the way to respect for persons all the same. So summing up, data sharing, yes please, of course. Open data at the outset, it would be sort of weird not to in several ways. But then there's the challenge of re-identification. We can handle a lot of that by ensuring good consequences. But then there's still this notion of respect for persons, which has traditionally been performed by informed consent. And that's the thing that we need to hold on to and not let go in this time of transitions. So no degree of just simple security or safety can handle the idea of respect for persons. So summing up then, we should not let opportunity lead to lessening of respect. Thank you.
Tusen tack, Professor Fossheim. Thank you very much. Message wall is active. You have created lots of quotes here. That's nice. How can we really make people understand the real risks and benefits in the age of Trumpism and disdain of knowledge? Understanding written language is not easy if the presumption is that professionals are not to be trusted. Well put, message wall. We will be taking your questions from the audience in just a little while here, so if you have any questions, think of them now and be ready to ask for the microphone. But before we do that, we will hear some comments from Leena Suurpää, who is Research Director at Finnish Youth Research Networks.
I will be here because I'm quite short that you can see me and I can see you. Good morning, good day everybody. I'm Leena Suurpää and I'm very grateful for the invitation. Hej alla nordiska kollegor. Thank you very much, Hallvard Fossheim, for your insightful and very interesting and I think very important thoughts related to the openness of science and its relationship to the research ethics. I think it is a particularly important theme to be discussed here. And as Hallvard pointed out, openness of the science is a topical issue today, but it's also a universal scientific virtue. It's something which has always been a part of science. So it's a universal, it's embedded in every single academic work, regardless of time and place. Openness is closely linked with the security and insecurity of scientific data, but also, and even more importantly, with the daily life of academic scholars in contemporary world, both in the Nordic countries, in Europe, and throughout our globe. And in this commentary speech, I would like to bring up to the floor the freedom of expression as one particularly topical and fragile condition of open science, being also linked with a debate on research ethics taken up by Hallvard a couple of minutes ago. At the same time as academic scholars are demanding to conform the rules related to open science, the environments in which the academic world work is done have become increasingly insecure, in many ways even dangerous. Insecurity is not a new phenomenon in an academic field, but it has been escalated because of global tensions and because of the digitalization of public discussion, in which academic community is an important part, both as an actor and as a victim. We live in a paradoxical world where censorship meets seemingly open digitalized media environments, and they both restrict the freedom of science in serious ways. And I take very briefly, in 3 minutes, 4 points to somehow summarize this sad development. One threat linked with the freedom of expression of the scientific field is that scientific scopes, themes, methods, data and publication arenas may become increasingly narrow. Contested phenomena and unprejudiced ways of doing academic work become more marginalized in the situation in which an increasing amount of researchers experience daily threats. The result may be that the researchers avoid taking any risks, which I see as a very important condition of open thought and consequently also for open science. There has been a lot of discussion of self-censorship of the artists. I think the same discussion concerns also the field of researchers. Secondly, if the researchers restrict themselves to the safe comfort zones, there is a risk that the research communities become more alienated of the complex world that they should analyze and give advice to. The alienation, in its turn, may imply that the recognition of scientific knowledge diminishes, likewise its societal impact, and it will be seen as an act of an elitist group, the stereotype which is already now rather strong. Thirdly, this is a sad development for the open science as well as for the open community of scientists. Open discussion regarding scientific work can be seen as a prerequisite for the innovation and for the development of our academic life, but also for our societal life, and a good life of the academic scholars. Fourthly, increasing security of academic communities is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not a Finnish phenomenon, it's not a European phenomenon only. We hear every day about persecuted and imprisoned researchers in Turkey, in Egypt, in Russia, you name it. Regardless of whether we look at the insecurity of the research communities as an offense against human rights or as a threat to the fulfillment of open science and open data at the top research level, we can't let the individual researchers to face this problem alone or to react only to the individual cases. The responsibility for the freedom of expression of the research communities as a part of open science should be seen as collective. So finally, that's why I'm very grateful for any attention that has been paid in Finland and elsewhere to this matter. As one promising example from Finland, I would like to raise up the collaboration between scientific communities, the Committee for Public Information in Finland, which is an expert body attached to the Ministry of Education and Culture, and Finnish PEN, which is a part of the International Association of Writers promoting freedom of expression. A particular committee for the academic scholars has been planned to be implemented within the framework of Finnish PEN in order to support the freedom of expression of the scientific communities as one important condition of the open science. I really hope this kind of collaboration, democratic, open collaboration, could be further developed also at the Nordic level and at the European level. I think that the responsibility for the freedom of expression of the researchers and scientific communities is a human right, universal human right, and this is a global responsibility we should take for the development of this kind of openness as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Leena Suurpää, Research Director for the Finnish Youth Research Network. So, the clock is 11 and we will be having a short refreshment break in just a little while. But before that, now it's time for me to turn over the mic to you. Anyone here in the audience who wants to ask a question? So now you should should use that opportunity. We have the microphone waiting here. Do we have anyone who wants to, if you want to ask in Finnish or Swedish, it's quite okay. Voitte kysyä myös suomeksi. Ni kan fråga också på svenska, så översätter jag frågan sen. Here we have someone who wants, so please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Liisa Evert, coming from the University of Turku. I'd like to ask from Mr. Bergelman if Commission has any thoughts about the merits for the scientists of opening data, opening research materials, what kind of academic merits they could achieve from that.
Still me, yeah. So I can answer in Flemish if you want.
Oh, please, I can translate.
So thanks for your question, because as you can imagine, there is a lot of stories behind these slides, and I was only given 25 minutes, so I cannot say everything. But your point is actually one of the most important drivers for open science. There are I think two to three very important reasons why we need to support it, regardless of the emotions. First of all, it's the best way to justify our public spending on research. It's public money, so it should be publicly available at all levels of the cycle. Secondly, it allows better, what your question, it allows better research because you can reproduce it. And you can use the data already available, so you have a shortcut to better data if you go in that direction. Your research can be tested at all levels of the cycle because you put it in an open way, so you can bring in different other peers if you want. And as a result, you can assume that the research process will be better and certainly faster. If I made my PhD in the prehistoric times before the computer, you know, you go to your promoter, then you get a topic, you go to the library, 6 months later you come out of the library and because you have read everything and then you have a question. Now you can do that now in 3 days. You post a question on ResearchGate, on Mendeley, on Figshare, and in the evening you know more or less the state of the art. I'm making a shortcut here, but I'm not giving any preference for these companies, by the way, conflict of interest, but that's the point. So the merits for research is that it allows you for better, faster and more pertinent research, also to work in a much more cross-disciplinary way. Of course, the big issue, and that's why I said this about the rewards, will this be translated into your career opportunities? That's the big issue. That's the incentive point. Because we talked a lot with the young researchers at all levels, at all associations, and over again we got the same comment. Yes, it is good, but if I give it, what is if I make my data open, first of all, will I get the credit? And secondly, will my university recognize it because I have to do an effort to make the data accessible in the FAIR principles? So there you see that if we don't solve that issue, and that is an issue of universities, this is something nor the ministry nor the commission can nor should resolve, but if universities don't translate openness and open science as an element in the career track, it will take time. But I personally think that, if I speak too long, please tell me, because I can go on a whole day on this. So if I personally think in 10 years' time these things will have changed fundamentally, because for example, you already see now journals on data. You see initiatives, when I presented the cycle, you see initiative where the data production that you do as a researcher is being valued and is being assessed. So you can very well imagine that in 10 years' time, just like you have research teaching professors or statistic professors, you will have data producing professors. Because you're so good in making data, and they are used so many times that it is used as an indicator of your scientific quality, just as much as it is used an article in Nature as your indicator. It's not a coincidence that all big publishers are increasingly developing platforms to keep track of data production and so on. So I think that is it is you know, it is a system thing. It goes together. One will not change if the other change. So the question is, who will first break the circle? But if universities would start making incentives, if funders keep pushing for it, and the Bill Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, if you don't go for open access in data and in publishing, you don't get the fund anymore. So you will see it changing very quickly. The Commission will, from next year onwards, make it mandatory. So the cycle is increasing. Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, because I quite liked your the point raised by the previous speaker on trust. I really think that the trust of personal data and can we trust the use of our data is precisely one of the main reasons for the Open Science Cloud, to provide a trusted environment where you know that your data are used in an ethical/research justified way. And I think that is a key bottleneck. If that is not the ambition of the Science Cloud, and I'm looking to some of my acolytes here, if that is not one of our key ambitions, it's not only about faster science, but it's also about trusted use of science. If we cannot guarantee that, and technologically, I think we can do it, we have missed one of our main objectives, that we allow that the data of a hospital in south of Spain are used by researchers in Finland, and that the people, the patients and the administrators in the south of Spain know that it is done in a way that they would do it as well, because the Open Science Cloud offers you the protocols and the format to do it in a way that is accepted at the European level. So that is really an important target.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude Burgelman. So, does anyone else have a question? Here we have one.
Well, Thomas Wilhelmsson, Chancellor, University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for a very interesting analysis of the issue of research, or this part of research ethics in the new situation. When you employ those principles, of course, you end up in lots of difficult balancing situations and ethical argument, which we are used to dealing with on a national level, and we have various systems for nationally discussing where the limits of ethics are to be drawn. Before you get your big international banks in place, how shall we deal with the fact that with open science, we had one solution mentioned here, but how do you see more generally with open science kind of opening up data internationally? How shall we deal with these ethical questions which arise in a way that we keep the trust globally?
Well, thank you. Actually, I do have a very simple answer to this. I just did the long route earlier for fun. No, it is a very difficult situation, and it's one that's not really solved in the abstract, I think. But one thing that's absolutely crucial now is that with these real changes going on the level of research, there must be corresponding changes on the level of ethical reflection. So if there is sort of de facto global international sharing of data, or within a certain zone, something will have to be put in place so that there's no doubt who's responsible, who's going to fix this, and who's to blame if it goes wrong. That's sort of I think that we need to ensure that there is a system for these things, so that it doesn't sort of get out of hand more than it has to. That's at least part of my response.
Thank you for that answer, Hallvard Fossheim. And now, I think my clock is telling me that it's time for a little break.